Hey, Gleb, welcome to the show today. As a way of getting started, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Happy to, Brian, and thank you again for welcoming me on the show. My expertise in helping folks avoid disasters. Now, disasters, when you look at the disasters, and that's my expertise, they come from our decisions. And unfortunately, our decisions are the only things that lead to disasters. There are two broad types of decisions that lead to disasters. One is our intentional decisions. When we make a decision that we think will be good for us, but it actually ends up being pretty bad, pretty disastrous. Happened to me. I'm sure it happened to much, if not all of the listeners of the podcast. That's one category of decisions. Our intentional decisions that we think will be good, but they don't know bad. The other type of decision that leads to disaster is when we fail to make a decision. We fail to make a decision and the outcome is a disaster. So when we miss something like a pandemic that starts up in the middle of nowhere, China, right? Or some email that we just let slip through our mind and then that turns out to be much more important than we thought. So those things can all lead to disasters. Now, if you look at the root of disasters, and that's what I study, they come from our mental blind spots. And that's what my book is about, the blind spots between us, how to overcome unconscious cognitive bias and build better relationships. And that's what my expertise is in: speaking, consulting, coaching, and training on this topic, which I've been doing for 20 years as the CEO of Disaster Avoidance Experts. And I've also spent 15 years in academia studying these topics as a cognitive neuroscientist and behavioral economist. I spent 7 years as a professor at Ohio State and researching these topics. I have the academic credentials and I've been in the real business world. And my passion is helping leaders, helping all sorts of folks, helping sales professionals avoid the mental blind spots, what are called cognitive biases that lead to these disasters, especially in our relationships.
And how'd you get into this? Was there a particular
Well,
disaster, either in your life or someone close to yours?
it was actually from my childhood. So I was fascinated with decision making from my childhood when I was observing my parents interact in ways that were pretty disastrous for their relationship. I'll give you an example. So my mom liked to buy nice clothing, and she'd go out, she'd buy $100 sweater. My dad was kind of a cheapskate, so she'd come home and he'd yell at her, saying, "No sweater should be worth over $20." And then they go at it. She'd bring up something he did, he'd bring up something else she did, and then it would be off into a rolling spiral of conflict and recriminations. And as a kid, I saw that, and that was really painful for me, observing their disastrous decision making on their relationships. So that led me to try to think about, well, why do they do this? And the thing is, they kept doing this, the same sort of pattern over and over again. And these are the patterns that I later learned about that are called cognitive biases. But I didn't know that at the time. I just knew that that was not the right way to live, and that was not the right way to make decisions about how to relate to each other and how to communicate effectively. But nobody sat me down and say, "Hey, kiddo, here's how you make good decisions. Here's how you make bad ones." Nobody taught me that in school. Nobody taught me that in college. That's not taught in business school. That's not taught anywhere. And so I decided to study this myself. And I started studying about it. I started talking to others. That's how I became a consultant, coach, trainer. But I saw that there was actually very little good quality literature available out there on making good decisions about our relationships and our communication. So I had to go eventually into academia, studying these professionally, reading those dusty books and journals, 30,000 page articles that cost $30 to access per article if you don't have a university ID like I did. So that was an interesting stage in my life, but that's when I learned about all of the errors that I was making, and I felt ashamed and kind of doofy when I learned about all the errors and I'll be happy to describe them for folks so they can know my shame and know my experience. But that's how I learned about this topic, and I was doing moonlighting on the side while I was an academic, and now I'm doing full-time training, consulting, coaching, just because academia was not enough of a real-world impact for me.
Now, what's like the biggest one? Is it confirmation bias? Is that the biggest blocker?
Confirmation bias is what people really, if they hear about one cognitive bias, the confirmation bias is a big one. So confirmation bias is where we tend to look for information that confirms our beliefs and ignore information that doesn't. I'll give you an example from a really interesting behavioral economics approach. And by the way, cognitive neuroscience is the study of how our brain works. So the confirmation bias would be from there. Behavioral economics is the study of how we behave in economic situations. So there was a really interesting study done on over 1,000 where 1,087 board members of companies that fired their CEOs, organizations that fired their CEOs, were interviewed on why they fired their CEOs. And one of the top 5 reasons, 23% of the CEOs were fired for denialism, denying negative facts about reality. It wasn't that their performance, it wasn't the strategy of the company, it was simply them refusing to admit that either things in the company were not going very well, in a good manner, or that the market around, so internal culture, internal organization, or externally, that the world shifted in a way that was not desirable and that the company was not prepared to meet it. So that's one of the top 5 reasons that CEOs get fired is denialism. And denialism, a major part of that comes from confirmation bias. Now, what happens when we need to look back at why we feel the way we feel? Our feelings drive our behaviors and our thought patterns, and they drive these cognitive biases. So our feelings are the root of this. Now, if you look at the feelings, if a CEO feels that he or she is a great CEO, therefore their company must be doing great, and they filter out all signals of negative information. Anything negative coming to them, they filter it out. They say, no, this can't be true because I'm a great CEO and this must be a great company, right? They go from the inside out, not from the outside in. And that is one type of confirmation bias, where you ignore information that doesn't conform to your beliefs. The other component of confirmation bias is when you search for information that confirms your beliefs. So let's say if you search online for something like, is Tesla stock going to go up? What kind of answer will Mr. Google give you? Mr. Google will give you answers that Tesla stock will go up, right? The phrasing of the question is itself a form of confirmation bias. You're looking for information that confirms your beliefs, rather than saying something like, what direction is Tesla stock going to head, or something like that. So that's one of the biggest ones if people hear about it. Now, that's not the biggest one for me. So I told you I discovered one of the biggest ones for me. The biggest one for me that a lot of sales folks, so as a CEO and as a consultant, coach, and trainer, I'm in sales, right? Obviously, that's a major component of what I do. I do delivery, but I also do sales. So a lot of sales professionals, a lot of leaders of all sorts, entrepreneurs, people at the top of organizations who are definitely always in sales by definitions, one of the biggest problems for them and for me is called the optimism bias. Now, the optimism bias looks like this. When I look at the world, I see a place full of opportunity. I see a mostly friendly place, a place where I can gain. I miss a lot of the risks, a lot of the threats, a lot of the problems. I have very high expectations for other people and for myself, and for my ability to convince other people to do what I want them to do, which is not necessarily going to be great. I have 20 ideas before breakfast and I think they're all brilliant. That is what confirmation bias looks like. When a sales professional comes to his sales manager or her sales manager and says, yeah, these will be my numbers by the end of the quarter. This is what optimism bias looks like. When I consult with sales managers, they always tell me that the sales professionals inevitably overestimate their quarter numbers. And that is a form of optimism bias, where you tend to be way too optimistic about the future. And of course, that in some ways that's good because it motivates me to go forward. But in many ways, that's bad because your sales manager loses trust in you if you consistently overestimate your numbers and then you come out with the lower numbers. And of course, if you overestimate your probability of a sale, you'll be chasing sales that you don't need to be chasing. You'll be making bad decisions in how you communicate to others because you won't anticipate some of the problems and some of the issues that they might be experiencing. So you won't be able to overcome their objections effectively if you fall too much into optimism bias. So optimism bias is one that's not as frequently talked about, but it's a huge one for me and other people who are in sales, whether it's directly sales or leaders like myself.
Let's go back to Tesla, because I think that brings up like the innovator's dilemma, where the Tesla shorts look at Tesla as an automotive company. So they compare it against Volkswagen, Mercedes, BMW. And of course, it's wildly overvalued. But the market is looking at it like a technology company, a platform company. With the batteries, AI, self-driving, solar, an energy company. They're painting probably a little bit too rosy of a future. Leaders fall into this innovator's dilemma, where they're so invested, the Kodak problem.
Yeah.
They're a film company making a digital camera that makes no sense to them. even though it's the future.
Yep.
What is that bias that you can't
So,
see what's obvious?
well, when you can't see it's obvious, you have a combination of optimism bias. You have a combination of confirmation bias. You also have there's there's a cognitive bias called the IKEA effect, and here we have to go back to emotion. So optimism obviously comes from your positive emotions. You'll see and there's, by the way, there's a pessimism bias. So the opposite of optimism bias. So if you look at in companies, people who would have the pessimism bias would often tend to be people in finance, people, finance, accounting, payroll,
HR,
lawyers. Yes, yes. Some people in HR.
regulators.
Yes, exactly. Yes, the controlling functions. So in companies, those would tend to be people who have the pessimism bias, kind of very risk averse. So there is optimism bias is not the only problem. There's an opposite problem, but there's an additional cognitive bias called the IKEA effect. Now, the IKEA effect is actually named for the furniture giant IKEA because of a well-known tendency where when people build their own furniture, they tend to greatly overvalue it on the open market. So, if you build a table and the open market will give you $50 for it, you'll tend to value it at $200. And there have been studies showing this, that people will not be willing to give up furniture they build. So, when people do home improvements in their home, right? They think that the home improvement, however much they spend on the home improvement, should increase their home value that much. Not the way it works, folks. That is not how it works, but that's how it feels. So whatever you construct yourself, whatever you make yourself, you have an emotional attachment to it. You feel positive about it. You pour your emotions into it, your heart, your baby, and then you have too strong of an attachment to it. So that's part of the innovator's dilemma, whatever you create. And so people who are invested into Tesla, people who tweeted out Tesla is great and who bought the stocks and who buy into the cult of personality around Elon Musk. I'm not criticizing cult of personality or precisely. It's just it is what it is. He has a cult of personality, right? So that is when people buy into that, they pour their emotions into it and they feel strongly attached to it. So they will tend to overvalue Tesla stock because they value themselves, their attachment to it too much. So you have kind of an IKEA effect going on as part of the innovator's dilemma when you create something and you pour too much into it. So Kodak, by the way, actually created the first digital camera in 1983. So not everyone knows that. Clearly know that. So the engineer in Kodak created it, but they chose not to develop it. They chose to put it on the shelf because they thought, well, we're a film company. Also, when they were looking at the 1990s, early 1990s, at their profit margins. They tried to look at the profit margins from digital. They looked at the profit margins from film, and they saw that the profit margins from film were 62%. From digital, it was something like 30%. So just half of that. And they thought, well, why should we go into the digital if we're already well positioned in film? We'll just keep going film. Well, what they discovered is, 60% of zero is still zero, as digital became the future, and that was clearly a bad idea.
And is there a name for the inability to see the future, where we think tomorrow is going to be just like today, regardless?
Mm-hmm. Yes. So that's not necessarily something that has to do with the innovator's dilemma. It's a part of who all of us are. So if you think about yourself in the future, 5 years from now, this is not about innovation. Think about yourself 5 years from now. You probably think of yourself as an older version of yourself, a little bit wiser, but mostly the same value, social circle, living in the same house, most of you, and so on. This is what people tend to think about. But think about yourself 5 years ago. You'll probably realize you're in many ways a very different person than you are right now. Kind of 5 years is a long time. There are a lot of things that happen, shape you in powerful ways. But we don't realize that in 5 years, we will probably be just as different as we were 5 years ago. And that's a really profound insight. And it's very hard for us to internally realize that, to internally accept it. Because when we look back at where our cognitive biases come from, they come from our gut reaction. So our gut reactions are wired for the savanna environment, not for the modern environment. You might have heard of it as the lizard brain, the saber-toothed tiger reflex. When we had to, in the savanna environment, we had to jump at 100 shadows in order to get away from that one saber-toothed tiger. That was great, the fight or flight response. But in the modern environment, we have many less threats like saber-toothed tigers. Our threats are much more ambiguous, uncertain, unknown. Like I said, some disease that begins in the middle of China, and we get a notification on our phone about it, or some kind of email, something like that. Those are the kinds of threats we face, but we still have the fight or flight reflex. And so going back to what we call the normalcy bias. The normalcy bias has to do with the fact that in the savannah environment, our world would be much like the future. We wouldn't change much ourselves 5 years from now, but we would be mostly the same. Would it become a better X chipper or something? You're not going to do that. That's not going to be something that's really going to be meaningful for you. But in the future,
to get out of that, we have to use a prefrontal cortex.
That's right. That's exactly right. We have to use the rational logical system, and that's kind of what I talk about in the book, the blind spots between us, how to overcome unconscious cognitive bias and build better relationships, how to actually address all of these cognitive biases and use our rational and reasonable thinking in order to address our gut reactions, which often drive us in the wrong direction. So this normalcy bias, it impacts us in a wide variety of ways, not simply in the innovator's dilemma. It's a specific way that it does so. But another way it does so is, let's think about COVID-19, right? Major crisis, major issue. Lots of people who reacted to COVID-19, they reacted with the fight or flight response. The flight response, they ignored it. They said, it's not a big deal, nothing more than a common cold, it'll go away quickly, no need to worry about it. The fight response, shutting down absolutely everything, doing everything, shutting everything down, not the right response either. We need to have a balanced response that thinks about the various dynamics of what's going on. I mean, we don't even have contact tracing and all that set up yet, which would be much more effective than just shutting everything down and much cheaper. But anyway, the people don't tend to think about these dynamics. They think about what's the most simple, clear way I can address it, flight or fight, instead of thinking about, well, what's actually the future going to be like? The COVID-19 has disrupted our world in a very fundamental way. We'll never go back to December 2019 because it's clearly spreading widely around the country. People aren't realizing that you're going to have waves of reopenings and closings because government is not really very good at dealing with this, especially in this country. So this is not a good situation.
Right, but we
people
dealt with the Hong Kong flu, which was 5 or 10 times more deadly, and no one even remembers it. I asked my mother, do you remember the Hong Kong flu? When was that, 68? No?
Yeah.
Never got vaccine.
And that's something that what people don't realize, how our world is changing, how the dynamics are changing, how other people will react around them. The government officials are not necessarily going to be rational. Business leaders are not necessarily going to be rational. You need to predict how they will react and see what the world will be like accordingly, based on the reaction. We will never go back to the normal state of things. And so that normalcy bias is something that really impacts us in a very negative way and is a part of the innovator's dilemma.
Right, but now people are looking at this is normal. This is not normal.
Of course it's not.
And a year, 2 years from now, it's not going to be like this. But everyone's kind of treating it like it's going to be. Now, you consult with leaders. How do you get them out of the normalcy bias, thinking that everything's linear and consistent instead of cyclical?
Well, what I do is I give them that 5-year example about themselves to viscerally help them understand, because the first thing you need to do when you're dealing with any of these biases, and over 30 of the most dangerous ones are described in my book, The Blind Spots Between Us, How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias
what about the other
and Build Better Relationships.
There's only 30 dangerous ones.
The 30 most dangerous ones for relationships. I have to be limited. I have other books. I have other books, Brian. Check out my bookshelf over there. So that's the one those are the ones that are most dangerous for our relationship, for effective communication, problem solving, and so on. I talk about other ones in different books, but the 30 most dangerous ones are there, and I talked about only a few here. So then what you need to do with the normalcy bias, any of these biases, the first step is to realize how you personally fall into it, how it impacts you in your life. And that when you talk to leaders about, hey, 5 years ago, 5 years from now, that viscerally hits them and they see, okay, yes, I can see that. And then help them realize that that's likely what's going to happen to their company. When they think about their company 5 years from now, they think of their company as a larger, more expansive, little, somewhat better version of itself.
Yeah.
But if they look at it 5 years ago, they'll see it's a very different company, So that is the first step to getting out of the normalcy bias, realizing where you fall into it, and then realizing that your field of vision is incredibly narrow for the future. It's incredibly narrow. You need to greatly expand it and think about what are all the possible scenarios. So we talked about, you brought up COVID-19. One possible scenario is that in a year or two, we'll have a vaccine, it'll be 100% effective, and everyone will be cured, right? Very unlikely scenario, according to the research, the scientists, but it's possible. Another one is that it will be much like the flu. So the flu, we still don't have an effective vaccine for it. We only have a vaccine that's 50% effective. And COVID-19 is about 5 to 10 times more deadly than the flu and much more infectious. So if we have a vaccine that only cuts infection by 50%, and we know that only about 50% of the population is willing to take a vaccine according to latest research, that will not be a very effective situation to deal with COVID-19. Right, so we need to think about how you will manage your company in that sort of world. And there are so many other scenarios that, maybe we'll have an effective vaccine in 5 years, 100% effective. What will that look like? So even if you're dealing with only one issue, and lots of companies, I'm working with a lot of companies, disaster avoidance, right, about dealing with COVID-19, you need to look at a number of different scenarios of the future, not simply your one scenario that you think is going to occur, which so many people are looking at only one scenario. Think about a variety of scenarios, plan for a variety of scenarios, see what kind of information is going to indicate what kind of a world we're living in, which of those scenarios are we actually moving toward, and then adjust your plan toward that scenario so that you have a number of plans, a number of scenarios, clear information that would show you which of these worlds we're moving toward, and then you can revise your plan as you see which of these worlds we're moving toward.
And when you're talking to leaders, what's the most common thing you see? Is it confirmation bias, normalcy, optimism?
Optimism bias. Optimism bias, and another one that's related to it, overconfidence bias. So overconfidence bias is kind of like it sounds. We tend to be way too confident. This is not simply about optimism. This is about pessimism. This is about everything. We tend to be way too confident about our judgment, about our decisions. Because in the savannah environment, we had to make quick decisions. When there was an opposing tribal member coming to us, we had to very quickly decide if he was hostile or not. That had to be a snap decision. And that's what saved us. So we are the descendants of those who had the snappiest decisions. But in the modern world, that's not likely to be the case, where you're going to be in a life or death situation. You need to be much more nuanced and subtle about figuring out the situation with reality. Going back to COVID-19, since we talked about it a number of times, science has over time shown different things about it. First, we don't need to wear masks. Now we learn, lots of people spread the virus before they show symptoms, so therefore you should wear a mask. And that's only one example out of many things about COVID-19 that we learned and we have to change our mind about based on the latest research, right? So that's kind of how science works. It overcomes itself. Previous models are shown to be incorrect, and you have a new model based on the new evidence. And that is not something that is at all comfortable to us. That's not something that feels right. It's not something that feels good. We feel like scientists are dupes. Why are they saying these things? Why are they changing their minds all the time? That's not what we feel is right. That's not what our gut reaction tells us. Well, of course, our gut reaction is lying to us because our gut reaction is optimized for the savannah environment. And so for the savannah environment, you need to make one decision, stick to it, and that's how you survived. That was good. Not in the modern environment. You need to change your mind often. That's why so many people, when they trade in stocks, we talked about Tesla, they buy high and sell low. And that has been inevitably the case. Because the stock market lies to you. Your gut reaction lies to you in the stock market. That's not what our gut reaction is built for. Exactly. So there are a number of traps in the modern world, like the stock market, where cognitive biases cause us to go in the wrong direction, including about science. COVID-19, relationships with people are one of the biggest areas where our gut reactions cause us to go in absolutely the wrong direction. There's a reason about 40% of marriages here in the US end in divorce, right? It's not like people start getting married and intend to divorce. They don't realize all the dynamics about it. And there's a number of reasons why salespeople don't make sales. that they really could have gotten, because they don't realize how to overcome objections, how to empathize effectively with someone. They don't realize that, reason, appealing to reason and logic is really not what you need to be doing. You need to be appealing to emotions, because emotions are the key driver to our thought patterns, to what we actually end up doing, to our behaviors. And you have to understand these cognitive biases, which will cause us to steer in the wrong direction when you try to appeal to emotions. So those are the kinds of things that we need to address.
Is that also true with analytical people? Because I'm sure when you talk to a CFO or an operations person, they go, no, I'm 100% logical.
I'll give you a good example about that. So there was a company, and I'm going to name this one because this client, they gave me a testimonial. They allowed me to share their name. So there was a company called Edison Welding Institute here in Columbus, Ohio, where I'm based. Go Bucks. So hopefully they play again someday. So the company is a company of 200 engineers. So it's a consulting, hard engineering consulting company, welding. They solve problems for manufacturers. Ohio is a center of manufacturing. So they solve problems for manufacturers that have larger mines and so on, that have larger problems, and they can deal with their own engineers. So they provided outside expertise. Now, what the company wanted to do was that they wanted their engineers to do more marketing and selling. Marketing meaning doing white papers, blogs, conferences. Selling meaning go on sales calls, talk to the engineers of those companies who they want to convince. So that's what the company wanted to do. And so the HR VP, Mark Madsen, he was giving them training, he was trying to convince them to do it, but they were very reluctant. The engineers were very reluctant to do that. So Mark, he knew me, he knew my work, he called me in. So about cognitive biases, motivation, the motivation engagement is part of my expertise. And he asked me, well, what's up? What's going on? So I talked to these people, I analyzed the situation, and I came back to Mark and I said, Mark, what you're doing, you're appealing to their logic and reason, but you're not really reaching their emotions. They're really fascinated with their technical problem solving. They really don't want to do marketing. You're not reaching them emotionally. And Mark looked at me and he said, engineers have emotions? Literally, that's what he said. I mean, he left me that in a testimonial, because he's the HR, he's very emotionally expressive, and so he's kind of empathetic, and engineers present as hard, cold, calculating, the Mr. Spock, like that classical figure. But really, engineers are just as about 80 to 90% of what we do, regardless of whether we're analytical, regardless of whether we're emotional, is emotion driven. Just analytical people present it in a different way. They present it as cold and hard, but they're still as emotionally driven as all the rest of us are. And so you need to understand what's going on under those analytics. So when I looked at how can we address these engineers, their behavior, what we saw was, okay, money is not going to do it. They were trying to throw money at them. Money is not a very good motivator for engineers, especially. It's somewhat good for sales, but not good for engineers when you get above a certain level of salary, about 60,000, 50, 60,000, 70,000 if you're in New York City, 100,000 if you're in San Francisco. So you're above that, good middle class lifestyle. And so what you need to do is figure out what they're emotionally motivated by. And what they were emotionally motivated by was status, social status among their fellow engineers, their reputation. So we were able to tap into that. We were able to change who was designated as the employee of the month, not the people who were solving technical problems, but the people who were doing marketing, whose profiles were written up in the newspaper, in the newsletter for the company, and who eventually changed the promotion structure to have promotion based on marketing much more than previously, and selling. And that was really effective in motivating engineers when we went to their emotions, what they really cared about. So you need to understand and discover what people really care about. And for salespeople, money is often just a counter of status. Let's just be honest. It's a kind of pride, I made this much, I made this much. It's all about status. It's all about where you are in that social hierarchy, which again goes back to the savannah environment, because we lived in small tribes of 15 to 150 people, and where you were in the tribal hierarchy determined how much resources you got and whether you were able to reproduce and how much you reproduced. So we are the descendants of those who cared a lot about status, who were very strongly status driven, and so we're still status driven, even though we don't have that tribal environment anymore.
Hey, so tell us about the book.
The Blind Spots Between Us, How to Overcome Unconscious Cognitive Bias and Build Better Relationships, talks about the 30 most dangerous cognitive biases in our relationship, communication building, sales and stakeholder engagement, all of those sorts of things, and how to overcome them effectively. So I talked about a number of techniques, and there are 10 techniques in all. The book goes into them in detail, talks about each in turn, how to use them to overcome each of these cognitive biases. So that's what the book is about, and you can check it out. It's available in bookstores everywhere. They might be closed around you, or it might not be safe to go there. So just get it online, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and so on. And you can check out my own resources on disasteravoidanceexperts.com, videos, blogs, podcasts, decision aids, guides, manuals, virtual training, consulting, coaching, online classes. Especially check out disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe for a free 8-video-based course on making the wisest decisions and an assessment on these dangerous judgment errors. Again, disasteravoidanceexperts.com/subscribe.